Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about the greatest story ever told, Mark's Gospel. Whether this is the first episode you've listened to or you're a regular listener or watcher, you are very welcome. My name's David Payne and I'll be your host and guide on this, the 25th episode of our journey through this ancient tale, which still seems highly relevant to life in the 21st century. Are you ready to join us on this unique adventure of faith and life? Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, David Robinson. He's an actor who's currently playing the title role in the Screwtape Letters, currently and recently, which has been described as Yes Minister in Space. So watch out for that. The trailer looks amazing. He's a founder of Searchlight Theatre and can be seen this summer at the Edinburgh Fringe performing, well, we might find out what in a minute. I'll let him introduce himself shortly. And Stephen Smart, who had this grand idea of inviting friends from many different backgrounds to meet up to chat about this great story portrayed in the Gospel of Mark. This was after several years acting the story word for word as a theatrical performance in a huge range of environments, using only himself and a chair. Soon also to be seen at the Edinburgh Fringe. Well, we'll let the guest go first. So David, would you like to start by saying who you are and maybe how you fit in with Stephen and the I Am Mark story? And where can we see you performing next?
Thank you very much. Well, delightful to be with you, and thank you for the invite. Yeah, David Robinson, as you say, currently artistic director of Searchlight Theatre Company. That's been running since about 2011. Prior to that, I was with another Christian theatre company, Salt Mine, for, would you believe, 22 years. I started very young, obviously, and became their artistic director, touring actor, writer, and then left to form Searchlight with a colleague. And since then, I've been traveling and touring major productions like the Screwtape Letters, which is currently in our repertoire, and also the story of Corrie ten Boom and The Hiding Place. And we'll be taking a production called Return to the Hiding Place. I don't play Corrie ten Boom in that, but a colleague of mine does, up to the Edinburgh Fringe. Palmerston Place Church up there is a venue we've used on many occasions. And it was up in the wonderful festival city of Edinburgh in August, a city like no other at that time of the year, that I met Stephen, I think over a coffee, and he was up there with his one-man show, and he asked, through a mutual friend of ours, Mark, a little bit of advice on bringing a show up and getting the best out of being at the Fringe. Thankfully, he didn't ask me, if you can make money at the Fringe, because that would have been a short answer, but it just how to get the best of being up there. And it was a delight to do that. And we've sort of kept in touch through lockdown, through Zoom, through emails, and through 2 dark years of very little Fringe or very little theatre activity, to be honest. And we're both heading up there this year for another production and another coffee, I hope.
I hope so.
Definitely. And thank you, David. You're very, very welcome. I imagine most of our listeners know Stephen Smart, who started this podcast. And Stephen, among many other things, is responsible for booking our guests. So I wonder, Stephen, what you'd like to add about your connection with David.
Yeah, I think I said before we started recording how much I'm grateful for Dave for those friendly words of advice he's given me over the years. And I'm very much a newbie in this whole adventure. And he is a very seasoned and experienced actor and director. And he's also a very kind man, as I'm sure our listeners will begin to experience today.
Okay, I'm really looking forward to exploring the feeding of the 5,000 today. This is a conversation between friends, so without further ado, let's get started. And if you, as you listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube, would like to comment on what you hear today, please join in and share your thoughts about the passage on social media and especially on the I Am Mark community Facebook page. So here is today's passage from Mark's Gospel, which is going to be read for us by Lucy Warner. Over to you, Lucy.
30 to 44, New International Version, Jesus feeds the 5,000. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than a half year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000.
Okay, I'm really looking forward to exploring the feeding of the 5,000 today. This is a conversation between friends, so without further ado, let's get started. And if you, as you listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube, would like to comment on what you hear today, please join in and share your thoughts about the passage on social media and especially on the I Am Mark community Facebook page. So here is today's passage from Mark's Gospel, which is going to be read for us by Lucy Warner. Over to you, Lucy. Well, Lucy, thank you very much. So today I have 2 actors in front of me, and I'm intrigued by how they view this passage. David, you seem to, when you're writing your dramas, use the text as a starting point. And I wonder what opportunities to present themselves from the text. I can't help feeling sorry, at least initially, for whoever was thoughtful enough to bring a picnic and had it taken away. What comes to you first of all?
Well, I don't think the miracle does. That's for a start, it's very complicated and difficult to portray on stage. I'll leave that to Stefan to do, I think. But for me, I often, when I'm writing, I think I'm very character driven. I like to write about characters, and I would position myself there, maybe not Jesus or even one of the disciples, but probably one of those on low billing in the crowd, and just watching an amazing event unfolding in front of them, and looking at maybe Jesus, maybe I'd heard of him, maybe I hadn't, but what did I make of him? And I think there's the caring side of him comes out amongst lots of other wonderful things in this passage about the miraculous food that appears. But I think if I'm right in saying, he's referring to them in this particular section of Mark of being lost, and they're needing help, they're needing guidance, they're needing a shepherd, and more than that, they're hungry and needing a bit of food. And he says, right, what can I, as we would if we were out on a walk or somewhere, we would start to look how we can satisfy that need for hunger. So I think I have been involved in dramatic productions of this particular section, I think probably of all the miracles, it's quoted a lot in everyday talk, whether they know it's from a gospel or not. But I think, if there's suddenly an influx of friends, family, and relations at Christmas, and you look around the cupboards, and it's a bit like feeding the 5,000 is often an expression that is used. And we certainly found that in schools, particularly primary schools, just reliving this story. Who's got a packed lunch out there? Okay, bring it up. What have you got? 2 sandwiches and a piece of chocolate. Well, imagine we're going to feed the school now. I mean, I don't know about Stefan. I don't often look out at an audience of 5,000 these days. He obviously does. He's a much bigger audience than I am. But even a school assembly of a couple of hundred, the sandwiches don't go further than 2 or 3 people in the front row. So how is the question? Does Jesus perform that miracle? An amazing miracle. So I think pictorially, there's a lot there. It's a lovely little story. I think I'm right in thinking it's quite detailed. So people think there were eyewitnesses there, one of the gospel writers, no doubt, but it's been very well sort of translated and told, and it's a lovely little story. So for me, transfers to the dramatic, to the sketch very easily. So it's been a good friend to me over the years.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And Stefan, you perform it word for word.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about when you go on stage?
I'm pretty much thinking some of the things that David's talked about here about the character of Jesus and his compassion for the people, as he said. But I'm also thinking, how on earth am I going to demonstrate a miracle? Because at one moment he's breaking the bread and giving thanks and dividing the fish, similarly handing these things to the disciples, and in the very next sentence, they all ate and were satisfied. And because I'm just miming, it's hard to in any way suggest that myself. So I'm always left perplexed how to portray that dramatically, but also what on earth happened.
Yeah, what were the mechanics? How did it actually work?
That's it.
Okay, so this was rest time for the disciples. Yeah, they'd had a tough time and they didn't have a chance to eat, so they went off somewhere quiet. We think it's the only miracle that appears in all the Gospels, apart from the resurrection. David, what's so special about this miracle for you? Obviously, the disciples didn't get the rest they were hoping for. What was going on?
Well, I think it's amusing. I mean, they're asked an impossible task. Yes. All right, here's the job, friends. We need to feed this lot as quick as we can, and they must have looked at each other in an astonishment, really. And I think I don't know where some of the disciples were in their sort of in their arc of believing what they saw in front of them. Were they still pondering? Were they still a bit confused? Were they still a bit unbelieving? I think for me, this would have been a bit of a market in the sand to look out at a huge crowd sat on a hillside. They'd gone for a bit of quiet. They'd gone for a bit of rest. And what I love is the detail of this chapter. This quiet place that they look for turns into a huge sort of, festival on the hill, really. And like most festivals, they were looking for the caravans with the food, and Jesus said, "Well, I need to help them. I need to help them," or more in detail, he said, "We need to help them. What are we going to do about that?" And I think just his, he's a man of lots and lots of words, as Stefan knows only too well. But this chapter is about the man of action. He put the action alongside his words. Yes, he did, raise it to the heavens and thank God for it, and everyone had enough. But I think for me, the essence of this chapter is words and action come together and dovetail beautifully, and that's in essence, I think, what you need to get across when you're dramatizing or telling it. It's not just a sermon, it's a very practical action statement as well.
I love that,
what
David.
Would you add to that?
Yeah, I just love that comment. That's absolutely right. It's a good lesson for us, isn't it, as followers of Jesus, that the words are important as actions are as well. I think, just to add a little bit to that, I guess I'm struck by the character, the personality of Jesus, as David just said, that incredible kindness, compassion, but also not only in terms of the words and the action, but also because of the power that's demonstrated. It's not just kindness and compassion. It's also power. There's something, the two things are hand in hand here. Something amazing happens, but also it comes out of a heart of love. And for me, I guess that really struck me as characterizing our God. It characterizes Jesus as we experience him. He's not someone who's the sort of king we would normally imagine a king should be, who rules with a rod of iron and dominates others, but actually he's a gentle king and a compassionate king. Nevertheless, he is a king. Mm-hmm. And that's something about the kingdom of God that's altogether different, I think, to any other kingdom that's ever existed or any other regime.
Yeah.
So that really struck me. And I think the only other thing I'd mention on the back of what David just said is about the disciples. I love that idea about the ark of where they are. And it's interesting, if you compare the disciples and Jesus in terms of their compassion, first of all, they are a little bit compassionate because clearly they've noticed that all those people were hungry, but they're only compassionate up to a point. They say, go, send them away and let them buy something to eat. And when Jesus says, you give them something to eat, they're saying, well, we can't afford that sort of money, or if we had it, we wouldn't want to spend it on them. So there's a limit to their compassion, which is a good kind of, maybe it's a little kind of lesson for us again here about how much we can limit our own compassion. I also wonder about this. I don't know about you, David. I also wonder about what this means when he says, you give them something to eat. What does that, what does it actually mean? And there are all sorts of theories. I have one. It's just a theory. I'd be interested to hear your view. My theory is, but perhaps he's giving them a little bit of a challenge, not simply saying you can help them, but also, no, you have the responsibility here. And there are other moments in the gospel, I think, where he does something similar. Perhaps at the storm crossing the Sea of Galilee, he says, "Why, where was your faith? Why you have so little faith?" And there's something about something about he's expecting them to do something, and to do it in the authority that he's given them, because that's what has happened in chapter 3. He's actually given them authority. I don't know. I'm only guessing here, but it is interesting. And their reaction is they don't understand that. They have no idea what that's about.
Brilliant. I think he is a great teacher, but I think he's also a great mentor. And I think he is trying to say to them, do as I do, walk in my footsteps a little bit. And here's what you might need to be doing when I'm not around, or you have the power as much as I do. So why, this is the kind of thing, maybe he's expecting them to step up a little. I know we're quite early on in the gospel here, but I think he's a great mentor and a teacher and a leader in its true sense, really. They must have looked open-mouthed sometimes at some of the stuff. I wanted to ask you, Stefan, maybe to get some advice from me, but how do you approach the miracles when it comes to dramatization, particularly these miracles over nature, finding food, calming a storm, walking on water? Do you start from a moment of, I 100% believe that happened, and I need to show my audience in some way how that was possible?
Yes, that is my answer. Yes, 100% believe it happened.
So do you walk on water during?
I don't, and that's the problem. Unfortunately, I've only got the power or the ability to walk on the carpet or whatever kind of staging I'm on, and it is difficult to portray, as I said earlier, these miracles. They are miracles, and that you realize your limitations when this happens.
It's interesting. The very first verse says the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported all they'd seen and taught. So the section before this was sort of sandwiched the bit about Herod killing John the Baptist. But before that, the disciples have been sent out in twos, haven't they? And they had come back to say, oh, look at all the things they've done, and then suddenly they wanted to rest, and this was one thing too many. David, there seem to be parallels with all sorts of things in terms of lifting Jesus's hands up to heaven and breaking the bread and so on. What can you see in that, and where does that take us?
Well, I think it's got to be symbolic of the Last Supper, I guess, and it's certainly repeated there, giving thanks and breaking the bread, and I mean, once again, like I was saying earlier, it's words and actions as well. He talks about thanks and he gives them a visual at the same time, and you know the symbolism. I think many people would say in what's left over as well. You know, he provides, and he provides with plenty to go around and more. So he gives generously. And I think there's echoes of that throughout the Gospels, but I think I would probably say, as many commentators do, that this is symbolic of what's to come at the beginning of the Gospel here. It's symbolic of what comes towards the end and the Last Supper. And I think we were talking a little bit about the Psalms as well, Psalms 23, that the shepherd looking after his sheep and providing them that they shall not want. They will have what they need and more. And I think that for me is the best characteristic I often think about when I think about Jesus, is that sort of his desire to give to his sheep, to look after them, to give them what they need and more, to give them friendship, to give them other sheep to be with, and for his protection. If one goes astray, he'll come and find it, and he'll put them in the pen together and make sure that they are safe. So there's lots of symbols and parallels, I think, to the shepherd and the sheep, and to the Last Supper. And I think, I don't know what Stephen thinks about this, but I think we're talking about the growing faith of the disciples, and I think I'm right in thinking that he goes on to immediately, he says, after this miracle, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat, and there is the walking on water in Mark, Matthew, and John. I mean, we do a lot of debriefs this at the moment. I think the debrief after this day must have been a pretty good one to be at. Feeding of the 5,000. What did you do yesterday? I watched Jesus feed 5,000 people, then he walked on the water. Okay, moving on. What a day that was in the diary.
Yeah. Stefan, thank you. One of the our listeners pointed out some quite striking parallels with Psalm 23. And we've discovered over the weeks from a number of people that Mark is very purposeful about what he's writing. He's not just reporting events. And so they sat down on green grass. I hadn't noticed before. The people which like sheep without a shepherd, by the Sea of Galilee, and he leads me beside still waters. He is the shepherd, and they all ate and were satisfied, and there were 12 basketfuls left over. Is that deliberate?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's difficult to know what to make of it, but to ignore the fact that there are echoes like that would be wrong, wouldn't it? Because they seem to be quite prominent. I'm wondering right now, as we think about this, maybe there's a bit of a drama going on here as well. You could look at it as Mark's interpolations, or you could look at it as how a first century audience might have picked up on some of these echoes. But maybe too, Jesus is aware too of what's going on. It's not simply a feeding, it's also a teaching. Maybe that's the answer to the question as to, I think one of the listeners wrote in, didn't they, and said, what is it that Jesus taught when it says he taught them many things? And Mark doesn't describe that, but maybe there's something in the actions that is the teaching as much as going alongside the teaching. So something about what he's doing, it teaches. And for me, if that's the case, it's quite interesting. As you said, David, the other David, I think, it's clearly reminiscent of the Last Supper. And then if that's the case, I guess we have to ask ourselves, what does the Last Supper mean? But yeah, and it is reminiscent of Psalm 23, definitely. Although I read somewhere once that the green grass bit is possibly an indication of the fact this is an eyewitness account, or at least based on one, that someone noticed at some point the grass was green, and that was a little detail that kind of scurried into the narrative. I wonder whether there's also something about Exodus here, and I'm saying that with a slight degree of guardedness because I'm not an expert, but it does seem to be reminiscent of the story of Exodus and the manna for the children of Israel. And I do know authors and scholars who've written about this at much greater length and with more expertise than me, far more. And the links with Israel for them, I think, are quite profound. So to give you an example of that, and not my ideas, the first of all, they're in the desert, the 5,000 men, that's like there is a number of 5,000 mentioned in the Exodus story of the number of children of the men in the Israel camp. There's something about these groups, the hundreds and fifties, the similar. It seems to be taken a little bit from the book of Joshua. There's also the book of Exodus, where they were similarly grouped. I love talking about these groups because actually, I don't know if the NIV has got this quite correct, but as I understand it, the Greek in the sentence where it talks about, so they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, the Greek actually describes them here as sitting down in rows of leeks, or like rows of leeks or onions, 50 times 100. In other words, they are like a rectangle, rows of onions. So that sounds like a military kind of formation, rather than like we would go for a picnic and we'd spread out as a church community in little groups all around the lawn. It doesn't seem to be actually like that. So there's something about that, about this whole group being reminiscent of Israel and God feeding them, just like in Exodus. And if that's the case, Exodus being, of course, the way in which Israel were freed from slavery to getting into the promised land. This is like perhaps a new Exodus that Jesus is dramatizing, perhaps. What does he represent? He represents freedom for Israel from slavery, not in the way they think, but in the sense of being slaves to death and sin. Not only Israel, us as well, bringing us through his life, death, and resurrection into freedom. I don't know. This is all speculation, but it's highly suggestive, nevertheless. I wonder what you thought about that, David R. Any reflections?
Yeah, I certainly thought of the miraculous feeding in the wilderness with the manna, and I think there's talk of sort of Jesus seeing it as sort of a fulfillment of his role of unfolding even more the Jewish religion and him being the Messiah and harking back to the miracles of the Old Testament. And I'm sure the observers and the writers, who, as you say, were pretty detailed in this chapter, would have been aware of that as well, and the importance to the Jewish readers of harking back to Elisha and Moses and the miracles of the Old Testament. So yeah, definitely. And I think on reflection, there's sort of three areas in the story. There's the crowd. What did they make of it, and what did they talk about as they went home chewing on a sandwich? And Jesus, he's obviously central to the story, and committing it to God and making sure that he was the shepherd of the sheep and everyone was looked after. And then I think the disciples as well. And I think if I was ever interested to go back to this story to dramatize it, I would maybe look at it from the disciples' point of view, just sparked a bit from what we were talking about today, in that rather direct instruction he gives them. You give them something to eat, and they must have sort of looked at each other and said, who's first? What should we do? And they very practically, I think, gave the answer. Well, we haven't got enough money. That would take months of wages or whatever they said. And the answer was, how many loaves you have, how many fish can you find, that kind of thing. And I think for me, the strap line to it all was what he was saying was, do what you can, go and find the bread, go and find the fish, do what you can. He wasn't necessarily saying, go and do a miracle. He was saying, go and do what you can and let God do the miracle. Yes. And for me, that's a lesson I think I need to hear. Maybe I can't do the impossible, but with God with me, maybe I can. And I think that's what he was saying to them here. Now, I'm not asking you to do a miracle. I'm asking you to do what you can, and then God will do the miracle.
Later on, it talks about, didn't you not learn from all this? Did you not learn about faith, perhaps? So I think maybe you've answered why it's so important, and partly what we can. So what else can we take away from this? Certainly, do what we can is a very and let God do what he can.
I think I'd like to reiterate what David said earlier about the generosity of God. And for me, this is recognizable. This isn't just what I read in a story. As I understand from my own experience, that's how generous God is. He is incredibly, unbelievably generous. That's his nature, beyond our expectations.
I would definitely agree. I mean, I think there's one verse that sums it up, I think, and it's only 6 words. Verse 42, they all ate and were satisfied. So the summing up of this whole chapter was, they all got food. Not only that, they all got enough because they were satisfied, and they went home happy and full. Amazing. In just a few verses from them, everyone's hungry, everyone's not happy, to they all ate. Every single one of them ate and were happy.
Indeed.
Brilliant. So is there one thing that you think, anything you haven't said that you'd like to add to our viewers and listeners?
I think there was a question about numerology, wasn't there? One of the listeners.
There's a lot of numbers in here.
And he was wondering whether they're significant. And I think I might have hinted that maybe 5,000 is kind of possibly significant. Who knows? I don't know. I think the number 12 ought to be looked at. It's not the only time the number 12 gets mentioned in this gospel. The girl who was dead and Jesus raised to life, Jairus' daughter, was 12 years old. Why Mark throws in that number, it seems a bit odd the way he does it. It seems out of place. The woman just before that who has the bleeding, she's been ill for 12 years. And it's not surprising that scholars look at that and think, is there something going on? And obviously I don't know what it was meant to convey, but I imagine the first listeners would have been quite, when their ears would have pricked up at that point. The first listeners being people who were used to this sort of terminology and numerology. The number 12 obviously has great significance for them. 12 tribes of Israel. And I don't know. When we get to it, we'll maybe look at this a bit more. But the feeding of the 4,000 seems very different because different numbers are used. What I like about this is that I didn't know this before, but apparently it's true. The baskets that were used here, the 12 baskets, the baskets were Jewish baskets, or baskets only people from Israel would use. They're quite large. You can fit a man in them. When you get to the teaching of the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000, the baskets that are used, a different Greek word in Mark's gospel, which is for a basket that's only used by Gentiles. And the 4,000 indeed are men and women, not just men. And they probably are in Gentile territory. So there's something going on here about Jews and Gentiles here, and what Jesus' ministry is to both.
David, have you got any other thoughts? I love what you said about the humor potentially in the whole story of just took
I think, like any good script, when you're developing it, it sort of needs a good beginning, then it needs a bit of a peak, and then it needs a bit of a conclusion. And I think this has got this, and I think the help, like you say, with the humor is in the detail, and there was somebody there, with a notebook and pen, and possibly, taking pictures on their cameras as well, because the detail is pretty good. But when they landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So I think the intro is compassion, and then what I said earlier about teaching and mentoring. They said to him, they need something to eat, boss. He said, well, that's good. Give them something to eat. We don't know how. Okay, let me teach you. So there's compassion, there's teaching, and then they ate and they were all satisfied and there was lots left over. So that's generosity. So I think for me, the three things that come out, great descriptions of our Lord, really. It's compassion, teaching, and generosity.
Thank you. Any one last thought either of you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that trumps it all. I think that was a brilliant point. Thanks, David.
Well, let's wrap up this conversation.
I think the stuff left over tells us, he doesn't only fill, he sort of fills to overfilling. That's what he likes to do, I think. So, it's that, he puts his arms up and thanks God for the food, and maybe he wants us to do that sometimes. Put our arms up. I'll fill you, and I'll keep filling you. And I need to remind myself of that. I know that on a daily basis.
Definitely. Well, thank you, David and Stefan. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll have started many more conversations among our listeners. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today, David Robinson and Stefan Smart. If you have thoughts about what's been discussed, please do share them on the I Am Mark community on Facebook, and you can also find a prompt there to submit questions for future episodes. Please join us again or listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music platforms. The more of you who like and subscribe, the more people will get to hear about us. However, the go-to place is the I Am Mark page on Facebook. This is where you can find links to watch previous episodes of Question Mark, find out about upcoming performances, and book Steph to come and do a performance for you. Better still, if you'd like to get involved and submit questions for future episodes, it's easy to become a fully signed up member of the I Am Mark Community Facebook group. If you're not already part of the group, just find us on Facebook and join in the conversation. And don't forget to check out David's website at searchlighttheatre.org. And why not come and see Steph and David if you're near Edinburgh in August. Well, that's all we have time for now. So it's goodbye from David Robinson.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart.
Goodbye.
And until next time, goodbye from me. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, make sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. Join us and our special guest next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.